Just like the title says, in this video we're going to talk through some of the most common concepts and questions from each section of the CFA Level 1 curriculum. Then we'll review how to best answer some of these common questions and look at certain ways that candidates will often make mistakes in these areas. It is important to note that these are all questions that are commonly asked throughout the curriculum of the CFA exam, through practice questions from the CFA Institute, or from third-party test prep providers. These are not questions that necessarily will or will not appear on any CFA Level 1 exam in the future. If you enjoy this CFA content and these study tips, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to see more stuff like it moving forward. Let's get right into it and start off with quantitative methods, otherwise known as statistics. Just so I'm not reading through tables, I'm going to put the information on this first question up on the screen. It says that the following information is provided about a stock market index M and a security I. This is a classic example of a level 1 CFA exam question that level 2 and level 3 candidates would complain about and say,
"Oh, level 1 is so straightforward, you just do a little bit of algebra."
And to be honest, they're exactly right. The question just asks you to calculate the beta. This is like a 2-variable algebraic equation, but this question is a perfect example of why it is so important to do exactly what I say is the secret to passing CFA exams, which is to memorize all the relevant formulas in the final few days leading up to your test. You can see in the solution here, the answer is 0.43, and it's a really easy one to get to as long as you've memorized the formula for beta. The next one we'll look at is probably my favorite example because you see so many of these types of questions throughout studying for the quant section in the level 1 exam, and that is a probability calculation. Honorable mention here though to hypothesis testing and confidence intervals, because those types of questions are also extremely common on the exams. I'm just not covering one of those here in this video. Back to probabilities. Basically in this question you have a scenario where a certain thing happens to a business unit that changes the probabilities of an outcome. This specific question kind of gives you the answer. They say that the new unconditional probability is like 23%. Use the Bayes formula to figure out what the old probability was. Again, you just have to have memorized the formula here, but that is a little bit more tricky for these probability type questions because there are so many different ways to spin these PAB equations. You'll know what I'm talking about if you've studied for the exam. But anyway, since you have probably watched my secret to passing the CFA exams video, you probably also spent the last few days before your test studying for these formulas, so this question isn't going to be an issue. Next, we're going to talk about ethics, and I'm a little hesitant to do this just because I can't really hone in on any common ethical concepts for the level 1 exam, or any of the exams for that matter, because to me it always seemed like the ethics questions that commonly fall in practice questions or third-party test prep material are all across the board. As a side note, all the level 1 content on ethics is the exact same content that it is for the level 2 and level 3 ethics sections, so if you can master this stuff, you'll be better off in the future. But for the sake of this conversation, we'll touch on a couple of the ethical questions that used to give me some trouble when I was studying for the level 1 exam. The first question just comes down to a definition, and it asks what it is called when someone's own belief that their ethical standards are above average is. Now this one's actually pretty straightforward in my opinion, but it gives a good example to show how some of these ethics questions you just need to have read through the material and internalized what some of these words actually mean to be able to answer quick questions correctly. One that was sometimes difficult for me was in relation to referral fees when working with clients and who you had to and how you had to disclose those to different parties. Ultimately, the CFA Institute says that referral fees must be disclosed to existing clients, prospects before you start working with them, and also to your employer. And then it'll get real technical and ask about if this disclosure needs to be verbal or written to each of these 3 parties, and they'll try to confuse you on which of these parties a certain question is about. So you really want to get up on how all these rules around referral fees work. Another one that threw me for a loop fairly often while I was studying is around disclosures, even of illegal activities by your clients or people that you know.
Wait, that's illegal.
In these cases, even of illegal activity, the Institute says that if local laws are more stringent than the CFA Institute's standards of conduct, and they say that these illegal activities need to be kept confidential by you, then you need to do that. Which always felt a little bit weird to me to check that box when I'm answering ethical questions for the CFA. Now let's talk about economics. In my opinion, of all the sections of the CFA Level 1 exam, Econ was the one that most corresponded with the material that I learned in college about that same subject. That is to say that if you were a good Econ student earlier on in life, you shouldn't have too much trouble with economics on the level 1 test. The first example here is a question about income and price elasticity. You need to know a little bit of the math behind these things, but also obviously the definitions of them. Furthermore, the answer options in this question pertain to a different section of the economics section of the level 1 exam, which is why this particular question is a good one to look at here. It's just knowing definitions again, but substitute, inferior good, luxury good, all those things are important when talking about price elasticities, and this question loops them all together. Next is a currency exchange question. They're not super common on level 1, but they're very common on the level 2 content, and I never really enjoyed doing these. This particular question is sort of one-dimensional though, so as long as you know which currency to divide by the other, you can do the math to figure this one out. Okay, now on to financial reporting and analysis, which is basically accounting. this section can really give a lot of candidates trouble. Here are a few examples of questions that come from content that you'll see all over the place in the FRA curriculum. At the start of the current year, Company A, which reports using US GAAP, sold a piece of land to Company B for $10 million. The land had a cost of $6 million. Company B made a $2 million down payment with the remaining balance to be paid over the next 5 years. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but you get the idea. They're asking about accounting rules on how you recognize profit in this business transaction. This profit realization question and other similar ones about things like recognizing revenues or depreciating assets are pretty commonplace throughout FRA. For the level 1 exam, you need to be familiar with them. Next, we have a really quick question about financial ratios. This is all just memorization stuff. I literally just created tables in my study guide when I was doing the final review before the level 1 test to make sure I knew the definitions of all these different ratios and which ones applied to which balance sheet line items. Next up, we have a question on the depreciation of an asset and how the company needs to report that asset on its balance sheet. I kind of already mentioned it, but these are just all tax rules that you're gonna have to memorize. That's the name of the game with FRA. Okay, for corporate finance, the first question I've included here is just a quick exercise on how to use a financial calculator. I specifically remember my class in university called Finance 101, in which the entire first half of the semester solely focused on questions exactly like this and using your financial calculator. If you've never picked up your calculator before, this is going to be the most difficult question in the world. If you've done this more than a handful of times, this is going to be the easiest question in the world. It's included here just to illustrate the fact that knowing how to use your financial calculator is critical to passing the level 1 exam.
Today I'm going to show you how to make the idle viewer.
Next is a question that talks a little bit about fixed income vehicles, but then asks you to calculate the cost of capital or cost of equity based on if a company had invested in that fixed income asset. It's a cool example because it loops in concepts from a few different sections of the CFA curriculum, and it shows how the institute can get a little bit tricky sometimes when they start asking a question and you think it's going to be a fixed income style question, and then the actual ask at the end of it changes directions on you and you realize that you have to calculate something else. Lastly, a real quick definition question. We already saw a couple like these, but not for the corporate finance book specifically. It's very important for the corporate finance section also to memorize these little definition type things so that when you get a quick question like this, you can just check A, B, or C, you'll know it right away. Now let's talk about portfolio management. I love this section, and anyone who works in financial advising or wealth management will know that this section of the CFA content probably applies most to their day-to-day life. And this question specifically talks about the behavioral finance sections in the portfolio management content, which is just extremely applicable to day-to-day life as a financial advisor. And I've found it really helpful to have a good understanding of these psychological concepts. If you've memorized all these, number one, it's really easy to answer that question. But also it's going to be helpful in determining how to manage conversations and relationships with different types of personalities in the future. But also in portfolio management are a lot of questions about portfolio construction. My favorite ones specifically geared towards the correlation of assets and how assets with higher or lower correlations will affect the return and risk characteristics of the whole portfolio. There's a lot of tables to look through and calculations to do in those respects, so make sure you're familiar with the asset correlation and risk and performance metrics. Okay, here's a super fun equity question. You see this type of stuff all the time throughout the equity curriculum for the CFA Level 1 exam, and it asks you to determine a fair price for the company's stock. This is a really sexy thing to know how to do if you want to be an equity analyst or a stock picker or anything like that in the future. But also note that this question requires you to have done some memorization of different terms of ways to calculate the model of a business. The specific one asks about the dividend discount model. The dividend discount model can be calculated in a very different way than different types of valuation models. So you have to have these terms memorized to know what the question is asking you to do. But once you have it memorized, it's a real quick like 3-variable equation. You'll know which numbers to pull from the table presented, plug them into your formula, and you'll get the right answer pretty quickly. Also in the equity book, there's a ton of content on how to calculate pretty valuable portfolio statistics. Things like active risk, active share, information ratio, standard deviation and variance, beta and alpha. These are all things that are often really helpful to be able to utilize well in your day-to-day work in the finance industry. But again, very, very common concepts throughout the level 1 curriculum. They're quick things, you just have to memorize what they mean and know which variables to pull out of an equation. Moving on to fixed income, the first question we have here is a real quick definition and answer type of question. I just want to illustrate that you're going to run into this stuff all the time on the level 1 exam, which is why, number one, it's really beneficial for you to have done a lot of practice questions because you'll get these things wrong and then you'll learn which the correct answer was. And number two, make sure you're paying attention to underlined or bolded concepts throughout the curriculum while you're studying. The next fixed income question is a great example here because this type of stuff is super, super common throughout all 3 levels of the CFA exams. Calculations using yield, price, convexity, and duration are really integral to how you price bonds and how interest rates can affect portfolios. All of those concepts are sort of interrelated in different algebraic equations. This this specific question asks you to just solve for the duration from one of those equations, but it can be spun in many different ways. You have to know this stuff. Derivatives and alts are both usually slightly smaller sections in the CFA content, so I'll just touch on one question from each of them here. For the derivatives question, we have one that just asks for a simple definition, like we've seen a handful of times already, and as long as you know what perfectly hedged means, you'll be able to get to the answer pretty quickly on this. For alts, we have a question that, in my opinion, looks a little bit more like a level 2 question just because it's sort of conceptually based. You have to understand the relationship between spot prices and futures prices of certain commodity contracts, but then apply that information to your further understanding of what roll yields are and convenience yields are to correctly answer this one. In closing, there's a really common theme here, and that is that level 1 is not super complex. And if you've spent the time either memorizing the formulas or memorizing the concepts that each of these questions is based off of, you're going to be real quick to start checking boxes when you sit down to take that exam. There's a link in the description below to the CFA website where you can see most of the questions that were covered in this video. Thank you very much for sticking around. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like here and subscribe to the channel. Both of those things help me out very much and I appreciate them. As always, thanks for watching.